Well, welcome back to the Encounter Faith Podcast. My name is Ross, and I have the privilege of hosting these conversations because for this series that we're in right now, I get to talk about what I always like to describe as the most critical conversation the church can have today, which is the conversation around the discipleship of kids and students. So joining me once again is Pastor Jake. Pastor Jake, welcome.
Good to be here again.
I like doing this now because it forces you guys to like almost be sincere. Like this is a fun game to play with all the different guests who are coming by.
But I am genuinely happy to be here.
Yes.
Kind of like a golden retriever. I'm just kind of happy to be anywhere, really.
That's true. I think
fair.
Those of you who know Pastor Jake, you would echo that. So here's what I want to jump into with today. So in context, you and I are talking right after a sermon you gave on Sunday that was focused on peer pressure. The conversation you and I are about to have is going to touch on a few different parts of this, but to start there, one of the things that I appreciated the most from your message is you helped articulate what kids are facing today with what we old people also experienced, but the ways in which it is so different and magnified for kids. So to ask a broad question, what are the ways in which peer pressure is the same?
Yeah.
And what are the ways where the stakes have been raised?
Anything that has to do with like the digital communication of things or the instant access to knowledge and information, that's where the stakes have been higher. So bullying back in the day, even when I was in middle school, high school, which feels like it wasn't all that long ago, but it kind of is.
Yeah.
You got bullied in person. Now there's like burner accounts. And for those that are wondering what that is, you can like make a fake Instagram account about people. You can put someone on your Snapchat story and it disappears. You can Snapchat in like real time. And like that kind of like that space is much more difficult. You can have access to beauty and tragedy in real time, which we never had that growing up.
Yeah.
You would have to go and watch the news on like a TV, and even then there's a delay. But now you can see those in real time. But where it's pretty similar is, hey, let's go do this dumb thing. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, that's dumb. The idea of wanting to fit in social peer pressure, because not all peer pressure is bad, but the ones that lead you towards doing harm to yourself or to others, or like compromising the things you deeply care about, that's often negative peer pressure. So that's what I really talked about is a lot of the peer pressure that our kids face, our grandkids. I was over in our sanctuary, which is an older congregation. I tried to frame it in the sense of like, they're not trying to be defiant towards you. That's not the case. They're just looking for community, and often we will forego and take shortcuts to find community. And I shared a couple of personal stories of myself growing up, but like the, sex, drugs, alcohol, that kind of stuff, like that's still similar to what we grew up with and our parents grew up with, but there's those added elements that are just significantly more difficult.
Yeah. And it's the kind of thing, especially, I loved the way that you framed it for those of you listening who have grandkids experiencing this, because the temptation is to create distance. The temptation is to create a distance in this experience of, I made these choices. Why can't you make these choices?
Yep.
And recognizing the ways in which they want to make those choices, but the road is harder to sow. And that
Definitely.
Empathy is such a better place to start, and can ultimately wind up cutting off a lot of, more dramatic issues that a kid may face in the near future.
Yeah. And I just think the divides between the generations, it's nothing new.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things on like social media right now, especially like TikTok or Instagram, is like the beef between Gen Z and millennials. Yeah. Like Gen Z making fun of predominantly like millennial women for like their front tuck and their side parts and their skinny jeans. Like, it's just interesting because like that divide, it's kind of matching the divides that's happening right now in other areas. But for the church seeking to actually disciple the next generation, to hand off faith, to help form those and helping them understand what they value the most, what does that mean for their Christian identity, and then knowing that they're going to be carriers of the faith, that's kind of important. So we don't have the option to keep people at arm's length, especially in discipleship, because that is the Great Commission. And man, when it comes to this intergenerational divides, the church can't afford to be the type of people that creates the us versus them. We just can't.
Yeah.
Or there will be no church.
And unfortunately, we're really good at it.
Oh yeah, it comes naturally.
But it brings me where you're going there is where I wanted to go next, because I think there is some folks who might listen to this who, whether they're articulating this or not, there's an extreme version of this conversation that is snowplow parenting. It is removing all kinds of potentially negative influences for your child, and therefore creating someone who is not able to make some of those decisions themselves. And I think about, in a church context, the classic example being like when your child's faith is hitched to yours rather than becoming more and more independent as they get older, we see how those types of kids have a much harder time owning their faith as an adult, having a lasting faith. Yeah. So I guess the curiosity for me is, how do you articulate the role of positive peer pressure, positive kind of a set of expectations, guidelines, roles, and rules? Because I want to make sure people understand what we are talking about is not this, everything is going to be handled for these kids by us.
Yeah. It's important to have clear expectations. If you're a parent listening, it's your house. It's your household. You are paying for the phone bill. You are paying for the car insurance, and that's okay. And so setting those standards and boundaries, like, you are not your kid's friend. You are their parent first, and that's okay to be their parent. You will be seen as a bad guy or bad girl every so often, and that's okay. Those are very, very important. But as they are getting older and aging, there has to be times of flexibility where they're able to be given more permission, and setting those expectations, just having those conversations of what that looks like. So, luckily, like, I'm the youngest. And so I have two sisters. I joke and call them trial and error, because my parents just, they did trial and error.
Yeah.
And then when it came to me, it was much easier because they had gotten all the kinks worked out with the first two.
Hilarious.
My siblings definitely hold that against me.
Of course.
But I came into the world and everything was great.
Yeah.
And, but I remember, like, my parents were like, these are the expectations I have. This is what I want for your GPA. Mm-hmm. If you're going to be in extracurriculars, if you're going to be playing sports, I want this as well. And I got to have a conversation. And there were some things where I was like, I don't think I can do that. And I don't know if that's a fair expectation. And it was a give and take. And I appreciated that growing up. So I had a lot of freedom. And the freedoms disappeared when, the terms of the agreement were not upheld. It was a bit of a covenant. And my parents, they wanted to hold me to a high standard, but they also wanted to set, especially my mom, and I talked about this yesterday in the sermon, my mom created the pathways of communication that no matter what happened, even in the midst of, like, my dumbest of decisions, I told her everything.
Sure.
And she was the one that met me with the most grace again and again. And she's the one that's had the most impact on even how I parent today, because she was just available, but still held standards for me. So it wasn't just, I can just do whatever I want when I'm into their household. It's like, no, this is our house. And these are kind of the values of this household. When you are in college, when you are out on your own, which I was before I got married, you can set those expectations and they can change. But for me, that was really helpful. And then my mom, I talked about this in the message as well. My mom helped me navigate, what did I value the most? And some of those decisions for our household was centered around the things that I valued. And I appreciated that.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes you think, Brene Brown calls it family-centered families.
Yep.
And the idea of having those open channels of communication allow for you to say, that's great. This is something you want to pursue, but here's these things that could impact. The classic example being the child who wants to do all of the extracurriculars and what that's going to cost for the other siblings, the other parents. And there's ways to do that isn't creating guilt, but is broadening their perspective. Yeah. And to shift this conversation a little bit, one of the things that I'm mindful of is particularly dads who are listening who I think in our generation of parents have a much keener sense of awareness of how they were parented.
Yeah.
And wanting to figure out how to do that differently. But for many of them, not necessarily being given the tools to do that. It's just a greater sense of awareness of, ooh, I like that, but I can't tell you why. And I don't like that, and I can't tell you why. What I'm curious about is for you and your wife, Barbara, how have you guys, you use the example of how your mom's influenced your parenting. How have you guys talked about that with your, like, preemptively as you're going into parenting your girls? And how have you seen that play out?
So far, a lot of the things that Barbara and I, because we, Amelia's 5, Eliana's 2, and so they're just now getting into things where they like certain things. So we've gotten them both into gymnastics, and we've talked through like helping them say if they want to do something, we will help them do it, and giving them a couple options, so that way they can still always remain and be a kid still. Right. Like I don't ever want my children to be overcommitted. It's going to happen. Mm-hmm. I think every parent here listening is probably sitting there going, oh, yeah, but when reality hits, you can't help it. We had our fall kickoff last night for our student ministry, and there's a student that is doing an internship, is coaching gymnastics, and for this internship, she has to have 150 community hours a semester.
Whoa.
And I'm just like, how do you pull that off? How can you possibly do that? Maintain good grades, have a social life, and then have some sort of margin for yourself. It's very difficult. So Barbara and I have talked a lot about like Sabbath and margin will always have to be the most important piece, because we don't want our kids coming into a school week dead. We want them to come into the school week rested. Mm-hmm. We've talked through a lot about the things that we didn't really like about how we were parented. My dad was a really good baseball player. I hate baseball. And so when I had that conversation with him about I just don't want to play anymore, that was hard.
Sure.
And then I did show choir in high school, and he didn't quite understand why. Why would you want to do that? And I thoroughly enjoyed it. And that bridge of like learning to enjoy what your kids enjoy is super important to us. Yeah. Because we both have experiences that there was something that we liked, and then our parents didn't necessarily do anything to kind of enjoy that with us. And I think enjoying something that your kids really enjoy is important. So a lot of it is like, that'll still come more and more. We're still young parents. Our kids are still very, very little. So their exposure to those types of things are minimal. Mm-hmm. But talking through like the good that our parents did with the tools that they had, because we're all being handed down tools from the parents that parented us. And that now we, like, if there was a tool that didn't work, but they just weren't aware, we don't have to pass that on.
Right.
One of my kind of big areas of issue is I do have an issue with anger.
Sure.
And so I am very quick to realize that, like, I apologize to my kids when I get angry. I make sure to like walk away in those moments. In parenting, I guess a framework for it is simply, we want to have good tools.
Yeah.
We want to recognize the tools that work. And we know that the tools that we use, our kids will use.
Yeah.
And so we want to be very conscious of like, are we using the right tools? And if we don't have it, go and get it.
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because this is the second time that you and I have done one of these where you've said something that's like been ministry to me personally. And it was this realization of, that the thing that I enjoyed that my parents didn't pursue was Jesus. This is not at all for the podcast, obviously, but it was this thing of like, talked to Tara Beth about enmeshed family structures. And I was like, that's why I didn't share. Because I was like, I don't want you guys to mess with this, right? The way that they had messed with my girlfriend at the time. Oof. And then I was like, but then hearing you say that, I was like, that's a level. I mean, I was an adult. It's different. But I was like, that's a thing. So, here's where I want to take it though for the podcast now. Okay. So the thing that I think is so helpful about what you're describing is it allows you and Barbara taking that sort of longer term view. I think is one of the hardest things to do in parenting, but one of the most valuable, because the days are long, but the years are short. Insert whatever your favorite cliche is there to describe the tension of particularly being a young family. Like you and I are both in that season of life. Yeah. One of us looks a lot younger, but that's a different issue.
It's the tanning. Not by choice. Just got very sunburnt this weekend. So
for the record, it's not, but I appreciate it. The interesting thing to me about, like, the helpful thing for me about that though too is I always come back to, for my wife Lauren and I, have like, this is also where we're practicing. The stakes are lower. Our kids are more malleable. You know, I think about all the different times where I've apologized to my kids and then gone, hey, what do you remember about today? And they've completely forgotten that even any of that was a thing, right? The thought for me, or to put this into the form of a question, I guess, is if I'm a parent who's listening to this and I recognize the ways in which the circumstances of parenting have overwhelmed me or have overwhelmed me again. Yeah. I'm curious how you and Barbara begin to work your way out of that, because it's a rhythm. It's not a checking a box.
Yeah. Complete transparency. When we recognize it in one another that we're gassed, that our tank is empty, we do whatever we can to make sure the other person can fill their cup.
Yeah.
This morning's a great example. We were getting out of the house, getting going. Barbara's getting ready to head to the gym. She's going to be dropping off Mia, bring Ellie with her. And I'd gone to the gym earlier and she's like, okay, I'll take the girls. I was like, oh, awesome. So I was taking my time getting ready and that didn't quite happen. And that's okay. I noticed that, Ellie was clingy and things weren't ready. And I was like, it's fine. I jumped out of the shower. I got changed as fast as I could. I texted her. I was like, just go to the gym. I'll get Mia to school. We'll work it out. There's just some times that it's a give and take, that when I'm less than, she steps up and gives me space. When she's less than, I step up and give her space. And then we have those check-in moments like, hey, how are you doing? What's going on? This is what I'm noticing. Is there something that we can do? Again, the other helpful piece is we have the best parenting hack. We live near our grandparents. And so also when we notice like, hey, we need to be together, like we can
there's a very helpful way to make
it is very helpful. Yeah. But just that checking in has probably been the biggest when we realize that the check engine light is low, is on. And what most people do, like in our bodies, we have check engine lights. Your back starts hurting. You're not feeling well. You're not sleeping. You and I wear a Whoop so we can tell when things are off. And the thing that we do the most is we push through. Like duct tape it, ibuprofen, shotgun something. Let's keep going. And you can't. Because you're going to hurt others. So that's been the biggest piece for us when we are overwhelmed with parenting, is we've become more hyper aware of each other. And that just comes from, now we've been married longer. I wouldn't say we've been able to do this 5 years ago. We didn't have kids, but we did foster care for a season and we were the worst. Like it was so hard.
Sure.
And it was difficult. And I know like I sucked in so many ways, but having more history of like getting to learn together has been helpful.
Yeah. What I love about that is, I mean, for anybody listening who's in a relationship, it is parenting. There's part of that can be not stated, right? Yeah. The amount of nonverbal, complete conversations Lauren and I can have would fill textbooks. But there are certain times, certain seasons where you actually have to state the thing.
You do.
Again, Brene Brown and her husband have this framework that I like of, they literally call it a number. And they're like, okay, where are we at? And one of them will say, I'm at like a 10 out of 100. Right. And the other one's able to say, I got 90. I got you.
Yeah.
And the goal being 100 between the two of them.
Yep.
So that when they have those moments of I'm at a 30 and the other one's at a 20, they go, okay, how do we lower the expectation for each other? How do we give grace to each other? How do we give grace to this house so that 50 is good enough to get us to bed?
Yeah.
And stating those kinds of things, and whatever, that's just one handle. Like stating those kinds of things can be a really helpful way to make the most important job of being a parent a little bit easier.
And it's okay to hit the easy button.
Yes.
Like in those times where life is a bit much, simplicity is good.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, Costco's great. Trader Joe's, we have a lot of their quick, like healthy, like quick heat up meals just to make sure we can have dinner together, because that's a value that we have. We do that with regularity, because there's just some times with the schedules and things going on that to sit down at the end of a day and you're exhausted, and to have an overwhelmed kitchen of bunch of prep, it's like, we can't do that. We know what's coming up this week. That's not going to happen. Yeah. And so it's okay to lower the threshold of function.
Yes.
It really is.
Yeah. Cause, I think people need to hear it. And I think people need to hear it regularly, because especially now we wind up in this comparison trap of not seeing the ways in which no one ever posts about the day that they've lowered their threshold. Yeah. Everyone's posting about the days in which their threshold was actually somehow 2 times what it actually is.
Yeah.
And the influence that has on our kids is it creates a sense of unrealistic expectations, or it turns what are supposed to be these core value moments, having dinner together, going to church together on a Sunday morning, into negative experiences, because mom and dad are always stressed when.
Yeah.
And I think about how it's so critical that, to put this in the discipleship context, right? Like if you make your discipleship something that's casual, your kid grows up not sensing it a priority, and their kid grows up without a relationship with God. Mm-hmm. So we are always 2 generations away from losing the church.
Yeah.
And when I think about how that conversation, I don't feel like is top of mind.
No.
For a lot of people. Where I want to kind of begin to land the plane here. You are someone who is in a key leadership position at our church. You are someone who's been a pastor for a long time. You have different areas of influence outside of the church where you're a leader. And my assumption would be that as people are coming to you in various seasons of crisis, various moments of crisis, there's so many different layers to that. Mm-hmm. And what I'm curious about is when you're sitting across the table from someone who is coming to you with, something going on with their kids or whatever, how do you begin to walk people through the priority of discipleship in this, the priority of presence in this, when they are coming to you with this like problem that needs to be solved? And your answer is usually there's actually some deeper rooted that the problem is actually a symptom. Does that make sense?
I think it was in our first week of the series, Marianne Swanson made mention that, Jesus has asked like 100-something questions, and he asked 300-something questions, and he only directly answers a very few of them.
Yeah, her number was 3.
3? He
directly answered 3.
3, yeah. So for me, I take my kind of pastoral counseling cue from Shrek.
Okay, great.
Shreks are like onions. Not that they're stinky, but they have layers. And so people's lives have layers. And so I just start asking good questions.
Yeah.
What do you do throughout the week? Where do your kids hang out? What do they like? What do they value? What sports do they enjoy? Do you have any food allergies? Very basic questions. And then you get to the root that often the biggest thing is there's just often just so much of just passing each other by.
Yeah.
And this expectation that this important work, could someone else please do this? Because I don't feel equipped to do this. And there's so often, and I want everybody listening to hear this, that pastors just sit there and go, why on earth are these people coming to me? How can I help? What can I do? I don't know. I got like ideas, but I don't know if that's helpful. And so in those moments, it's the beauty of, I think, faith where the Spirit presence is so important. And so God illuminates things to say. I lean in those areas. It's discernment. But that same thing happens for parents and with their kids. Like, discipleship isn't, okay, we're going to sit down and we're going to read one chapter a night and you're going to write a 200-page essay on this. I had a parent do this with a kid, and I said, is that working? And they said, I don't think so. I was
wow.
Yeah, no, it wouldn't. But talking as you're going and you're driving and you're dropping them off and you're doing touch points, that goes a long way. The staying curious, and then again in the message, they're not doing this to just upset you. Again, in a decade of ministry, working primarily with students, I've had 2 times in large youth groups that the kids were like, yeah, I'm just going to stick it to my parents. Again, one was someone wanted to date someone their parents didn't like.
Sure.
And the other was the families were vegan and he would sneak out and go to In-N-Out. And it was the most hysterical thing. But like, that was a value of the family.
Of course.
And I get it. Like, they were big into humane care of how food is made and processed. And there's a lot of question marks around that. This isn't a propaganda thing.
Right.
But like, yeah. But he was like, I want a burger. And I don't want it to be like a fake burger. And so he would sneak away. And he's like, I'm lying to my parents. I was like, this is a great time to talk to them about values and what's important. And in that moment, like, there were shifts that were made.
Yep.
Especially if you're a family that really cares about faith and you're raising your kids and the faith really sticks at a younger age. Just those conversations. So for me, I ask good questions and then I point them towards a step, just something very, very simple, and do it with regularity. So like this last week, I anchored it in a couple different steps. Like, prayer breaks down our walls and puts our hearts and our minds towards the people that we're praying for. You can't be actively praying for someone and also want their demise. It doesn't work that way. You can't be actively praying for someone and then continue to have feelings of indifference. It starts to go away. But the other piece I said is, like, parents and grandparents, you have to create spaces of ongoing communication. Your role and your goal and your privilege and the honor that you have is you and your stories, you get to help them navigate. And to do that, you have to be the bridge builder. Because more times than not, they're not going to come to you unless they know that you care. Unless they know that you are actively seeking them out. Because if not, they'll go to their friends. And that's fine too. They'll go to peers and other spaces, but you have such a right as a parent to step into that space. And not because I'm the authority in my household, which you are, that's never going to be taken away, but you do it because you want to see them flourish, because you're helping them move from adolescence to adulthood. And you're going to help them know what they value. And so that piece of discipleship of just simple communication is the biggest piece. And often when I'm in those discussions, that's what's absent. They're going in different directions and there's no margin in their schedules to have meaningful conversations together. And you just miss.
Thank you for listening to the Encounter Faith podcast. This podcast is a service of G. Shep Productions from Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Naperville, Illinois. All rights reserved. If you're in the area, we'd love to meet you on a Sunday morning at our 9 a.m. or 10:45 services. At Good Shepherd, we are inviting everyone to walk together in the calling of Christ for a life of eternal impact. This podcast is produced and hosted by me, Ross Cochran. And our theme song is Wake the Earth by 1111 Worship. Thank you for listening. We'll talk again soon.